John Adams takes the oath of office to silence, and the American experiment begins to die. On April 30th, 1789, a letter arrives at Federal Hall in New York City, carried by a courier from Mount Vernon. In it, George Washington, the man every delegate expected to see standing at that podium, offers his praise for the Constitution, his gratitude to the nation, and his absolute refusal to serve. He cites his declining health, the toll of 8 years of war, and a weariness that he says has settled into his bones. He wishes the Republic well. He does not wish to lead it. The silence in Federal Hall is not reverent. It is stunned. Washington had been unanimously elected by the Electoral College just weeks earlier. Every assumption about how this government would function, every compromise brokered at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, every assurance given to reluctant ratifiers in Virginia and New York, rested on the understanding that Washington would be the man holding it all together. Now the chair sits empty, and John Adams, the man with the second most electoral votes, steps forward to take an oath no one prepared him to take. Adams is no fool. He is a patriot, a diplomat, a man who helped forge independence. But he lacks the one thing Washington possessed that no argument or credential could replace: the unconditional trust of a fractured nation. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Newspapers from Boston to Charleston print Washington's letter in full. Some praise his humility, others call it abandonment. But what no one grasps yet, what will not become clear for years, is that Washington's refusal has removed the only force capable of holding 13 jealous states inside a single frame. Within months of Adams taking office, Alexander Hamilton presents the most ambitious financial program the young republic has ever seen. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton proposes that the federal government assume the war debts of every state, roughly $25 million on top of the $54 million the nation already owes. He calls for a national bank, for excise taxes on domestic goods, and for a system of credit that would bind the states to the central government through shared financial obligation. It is brilliant. It is also, without Washington's endorsement, politically suicidal. New England delegates rally behind the plan. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and South Carolina still carry enormous debts from the Revolutionary War. An assumption would lift that burden from their shoulders. But Virginia has already paid down most of its obligations. The Carolinas view Hamilton's taxes as punishing Southern agriculture to reward Northern speculators. Georgia's delegates see no benefit whatsoever in strengthening a government that has yet to protect their frontier from Creek raids. In the real timeline, Washington's presence provided Hamilton with a shield. The general's support signaled to wavering delegates that the plan served the nation, not a faction. Without that shield, every vote becomes a sectional calculation. Hamilton tries to broker a deal, perhaps a Southern capital in exchange for assumption, but Adams lacks the political capital to guarantee anything. The bargain collapses. Hamilton's financial program passes in pieces, stripped of the assumption clause, and the national bank is tabled indefinitely. Hamilton, furious and isolated, begins to view Congress not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Patrick Henry has waited for this moment. Virginia's most eloquent opponent of the Constitution had warned that the document concentrated too much power in too few hands. Washington's refusal to Henry is not a disappointment. It is vindication. In the spring of 1790, Henry convenes an assembly of Virginia legislators and Western County representatives. They pass a series of resolutions declaring that the federal government's power to tax is subject to the consent of each sovereign state, and that Virginia reserves the right to nullify any tax measure it deems unconstitutional. The language is careful. The implication is revolutionary. Thomas Jefferson, still serving as Adams's Secretary of State, does not sign the resolutions. He does not need to. Behind closed doors, he encourages them. Jefferson has grown increasingly alarmed by Hamilton's vision of a powerful central government modeled on British financial institutions. He sees in Henry's resolutions not rebellion, but correction, a reassertion of the principles he believes the Revolution was fought to defend. James Madison, who only 2 years earlier co-authored the Federalist Papers in defense of the Constitution, now authors a pamphlet arguing that the compact between states is voluntary and revocable. The shift is staggering. But without Washington's moderating hand, without that personal loyalty that kept Madison tethered to the Federalist cause, the gravitational pull of Virginia politics proves stronger than the logic of Philadelphia. The consequences of Madison's defection would prove catastrophic. But first, the Union has to survive what comes next. Madison had originally championed a Bill of Rights as a gesture of good faith to the Anti-Federalists, a set of amendments guaranteeing individual liberties that would reassure skeptical states the new government would not become a tyranny. In the real timeline, those first 10 amendments were ratified by 1791, and they diffused much of the opposition to the Constitution. Here, the amendments stall. Hamilton's allies in the Senate view them as unnecessary concessions that would weaken federal authority at the precise moment it needs strengthening. They delay votes, bury proposals in committee, and argue that the Constitution as written already protects liberty through its structure of separated powers. The Senate has only 26 members. Hamilton needs just a handful to block any amendment from reaching the two-thirds threshold. North Carolina and Rhode Island had ratified the Constitution, in part, because they were promised a Bill of Rights would follow. North Carolina ratified in November 1789. Rhode Island held out until May 1790, the last of the original 13. Now both states' legislatures entertain resolutions questioning whether ratification remains binding if its conditions go unmet. The legal arguments are tangled. The political message is clear. The Union is not as permanent as its architects assumed. In 1791, the one piece of Hamilton's financial program that did pass, an excise tax on distilled spirits, ignites resistance that spreads like fire through dry timber. Western Pennsylvania farmers, for whom whiskey is not a luxury but a currency, refuse to pay. Tax collectors are tarred and feathered. Federal marshals are turned away at gunpoint. In the real timeline, Washington personally led a militia force of nearly 13,000 men into western Pennsylvania in 1794, and the rebellion collapsed without significant bloodshed. The show of federal authority was decisive precisely because Washington commanded it. Adams has no such authority. He issues calls to the state governors for militia support. Pennsylvania's governor hesitates. Virginia's governor flatly refuses, citing Henry's nullification resolutions. Kentucky, not yet 5 years a state, sees the rebellion as a legitimate grievance and offers no assistance. Adams manages to assemble a force of perhaps 3,000, poorly equipped, poorly motivated, and uncertain of their legal mandate. The rebels do not disperse. They organize. And when the federal troops finally march west, they find not a ragged band of protesters, but an armed frontier population that views the federal government as a distant and illegitimate power. The confrontation is brief, bloody, and inconclusive. Federal authority west of the Appalachians effectively ceases to exist. By 1792, Congress can barely function. Attendance drops below quorum for weeks at a time as delegates return to their states for instructions or simply stop coming. The government in New York operates on inertia and hope, neither of which proves sufficient. New England Federalists, led by figures like Fisher Ames and Theodore Sedgwick, begin holding their own caucus meetings in Hartford, Connecticut. They discuss trade policy, mutual defense, and the possibility that a smaller, more cohesive union of commercial states might better serve their interests than a sprawling confederation that cannot pass a budget. Southern Republicans, anchored by Jefferson and Madison, convene in Richmond. They draft proposals for a looser association of sovereign states bound by treaty rather than constitution. And then there is New York. Governor George Clinton, who had opposed the Constitution from the beginning, positions his state as the indispensable middle. New York's ports, its commercial networks, its geographic position between New England and the South, all give Clinton leverage that neither bloc can ignore. He hosts informal meetings between Northern and Southern delegations, not to save the Union but to ensure that whatever replaces it, New York sits at the center. In February 1793, revolutionary France declares war on Great Britain, and the question that has been simmering beneath every American political dispute suddenly boils over. Whose side are we on? New England's merchants depend on trade with Britain. Their ships, their credit, their commercial networks all flow through London. A war with Britain would be economic suicide. The southern states, meanwhile, see in France's revolution a mirror of their own, a struggle against monarchy and concentrated power. when a French envoy named Edmond Charles Genet arrives in Charleston in April 1793 to recruit American privateers. South Carolina's governor does not arrest him. He welcomes him. Adams issues a neutrality proclamation. Neither side respects it. New England merchants continue trading with Britain under British naval protection. Southern ports begin outfitting French privateers. The federal government, which has no navy and whose army is scattered and demoralized after the whiskey debacle, can enforce nothing. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Not a battle, not a declaration, but a quiet realization in capitals from Hartford to Richmond that the Union existed now only on paper. In the autumn of 1794, John Adams delivers an address to what remains of Congress. His voice is steady. His words are bitter. He declares that the Union has dissolved in fact, if not yet in law, and that he will not preside over a fiction. He does not resign. He simply acknowledges what everyone already knows. The Hartford Convention formalizes what New England's leaders have discussed for 2 years. Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Rhode Island form the New England Confederacy, a compact focused on commerce, maritime defense, and Protestant cultural solidarity. They elect their own executive council and begin negotiating trade agreements directly with Britain. Virginia leads the Southern Republican Compact. Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Kentucky, joined later by Tennessee. Their framework emphasizes state sovereignty, agrarian economics, and minimal central authority. Jefferson drafts the preamble. Henry demands and gets an explicit right of withdrawal for any member state. The Mid-Atlantic Federation emerges last and most reluctantly. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware bind themselves together largely because geography leaves them no alternative. Clinton, ever the pragmatist, negotiates terms that give New York effective veto power over trade policy. The Constitution of the United States, ratified with such hope barely 6 years earlier, becomes a historical document, studied, admired, and ultimately discarded. Not because its ideas were wrong, but because the one man whose presence might have held its contradictions together long enough for them to become traditions chose instead to remain at Mount Vernon, tending his fields, watching the republic he helped create come apart from a distance he could not have crossed even if he had tried.